American Motors introduces the Gremlin.
Hey, George! What is that? The Gremlin? Oh, move over. He's doing
On April 1st, 1970, American Motors introduced their new subcompact car to the North American market called the Gremlin. A low-cost American-made car designed to compete with the smaller, more fuel-efficient imported vehicles, quickly gaining popularity in the North American market. Rivals Ford and GM both had new subcompact cars coming out for the 1971 model year, but AMC was able to beat them both to market. Despite its unique love-it-or-hate-it styling, the Gremlin sold well, especially with younger buyers, which was a market AMC targeted with this car. The styling is certainly unique, and the way this car looks is probably what it's most remembered for. It basically looks like someone just chopped the back off of AMC's compact car, the Hornet, and shortened the wheelbase. A bit of an oversimplification, but that's sort of what AMC did, with the Gremlin's design based on the Hornet's platform and both sharing many parts. I've always kind of liked the styling of the Gremlin. Maybe like is a bit of a strong word, but it's kind of funny looking and definitely looks like it's from the 70s. I do appreciate that despite its intention to be a small economy car, they weren't afraid to put in a V8 engine and offer some high performance variations, with the Gremlin X appearance and equipment package being introduced in 1971 and a 5-liter V8 being available starting in 1972. In honor of the Gremlin turning 50, I thought I'd build an RC version using this AMT AMC Gremlin X 1/25th scale model kit. I'll talk a little more about this project later, as I think a lot of you are really going to enjoy it. But first I want to give you all a detailed look at this model kit. To start, I really like the box art and how they show all the parts that are included on the back. This kit includes parts to build either a stock or modified version of the car. I found it interesting that blue tinted windows are included as an optional part. I don't think I'll be using them, but it's pretty cool that they included that as an option, and it's not something I've seen before. As with about all AMT kits I've built, they don't quite have as much detail as other brands, however all the parts looked very nice, especially the body, which is the most important piece. The kit's tires felt softer than what I'm used to, and I'd be tempted to use them if I didn't have plans to make my own. Another thing I like about this kit is the variety of exterior decals that they've included. Here's an overview of all the parts that are included. Everything looks well molded and should make for a great build. Of course, not all of these parts will be used for the build, but one part that certainly will be is the body. One thing that will be a challenge for this build is the small size of the Gremlin body. I've never built an RC car this small, so fitting all of the electronics might be difficult. Although comparing it to the 1/25th scale Camaro, it's not exactly a tiny car, and there should be a decent amount of room under the hood. It's always nice to be able to include an interior on any car I build, but if I'm unable to, it's alright. I have other priorities for this car. Since we've gotten a good look at the kit, I want to talk a bit about my plans for this car. I'm going to build this Gremlin to be a drag car. Some drag racing parts and STL files will soon be posted to Patreon, and I thought this Gremlin would be a cool car to use as a test bed. Sure, a big muscle car might seem like the obvious choice, but I figured I'd choose something a little different. Especially since I'd like to see if I can get the shorter wheelbase Gremlin to pop some wheelies. To build the car, I'm basically going to back half an FFR SC1 chassis. I'll keep the front half the same, probably building the same front suspension assembly I used on the 2010 Mustang, but I'll be cutting off the back section, either physically to an already printed chassis, or digitally before printing. For a while now, I've been working on some drag racing inspired 4-link rear suspension setups like this, which I'll be securing to the altered chassis. Of course, a narrower rear axle and wide rear tires will be used. If I'm able to include an interior on this car, I'll probably need to tub the rear to make room for the larger wheels, which shouldn't be too difficult. As far as paint and other cosmetic stuff, I'm not 100% sure what I'll do. Really, as long as it's fast, has fat rear tires, and maybe can even lift the front wheels up, I'll be happy. If you have ideas for what I should paint, let me know below in the comments. Anyways, that's all for this video. Keep an eye out for updates, especially if you're on Patreon. Happy April 1st, everyone, and thanks for watching. Hello everyone! In today's video, I'm going to be showcasing the design process of the chassis I'm using for the 1/25th scale AMC Gremlin build, as well as talking a little about this project and 3D printing all the parts. I want to start right away with showing the design process, which I began by designing the wheels. I'll have the footage from the design process going while I talk a little about this project and the chassis I'm making. The software I'm using is Autodesk Fusion 360, and the wheel design you see here was inspired by Weld drag lights. I like the look of those wheels, and they're a nice, simple, popular design, so I chose them as inspiration. It's also an easy design to model. So some viewers were a little confused by the previous video I uploaded, thinking that it was an April Fool's joke. The build is very much happening, and the reason for the April 1st reveal is that the AMC Gremlin was introduced on April 1st, 1970. Making this past April 1st the 50th anniversary of the car. I already had plans to do a drag build and decided the Gremlin would be a cool choice that's a little outside the box of a traditional drag car. Apparently a lot of you agree with this choice, as I think I've received more comments and messages from people saying how excited and interested they are in this build than just about any other project I've shown on the channel. Never thought an AMC Gremlin would be the car that so many people wanted to see, but I'm certainly glad so many of you are excited for this build. This project should be pretty straightforward. As I briefly talked about in the previous video, I'm going to take the pre-existing FFR SC1 chassis and modify it to have a drag racing inspired rear frame and narrow axle. From the center of the chassis to the front of the car, I wanted to leave it as a standard FFR SC1 chassis. However, for the back, as you'll see later on, I cut the rear section of the main chassis piece off and designed a drag racing inspired ladder bar rear end. I also modified the MA10 rear axle housing pieces to be narrower to allow wider rear drag slicks to fit under the body. The design process ended up being very easy and didn't take too much time since I'm mostly just modifying pre-existing components rather than starting completely from scratch. I do actually have a very scaled drag car chassis that's a completely original design, but that's for another project and another video. For now, I think this setup is going to prove to be a nice compromise. Another thing I kept in mind during the design process was making sure that I designed everything so that it would be as easy to 3D print on a typical FDM printer as possible. I think there's some room for improvement as far as making it easy to print, especially with the rear subframe piece. However, as you'll see later on, I was able to print all the parts without any issues, though I'll definitely want to do some post-print finishing work to some of the parts, and I also plan on painting the chassis. As I've said before when I showcase the design process like I am here, this is by no means intended to be a step-by-step follow-along tutorial. I'm just quickly showing the design process I used and talking a little about my thought process and ideas I have. Now and then I do get asked whether or not I plan on making any CAD modeling tutorial videos. The short answer, at least right now, is no. There are already so many great videos and channels out there that show you the basics of using Fusion 360 that I don't really feel that I can make anything better or really add much beyond what's already out there. If you're new to Fusion 360 or 3D modeling in general, I'd recommend searching for some tutorial videos here on YouTube that are intended for people who have no prior experience and begin learning the basics. If you're still really interested after learning the basics, you might want to look into an online course such as something you'd find on Udemy or Skillshare. You might have to pay for one of these courses. However, if you choose a good course, they usually have a nice learning flow where each video or assignment builds off of the previous. Plus, the quality will be consistent rather than the hit or miss quality of YouTube videos. Once you understand the basics, you can start applying what you've learned to gradually more ambitious projects. You'll probably also get more out of watching a video like this since you'll recognize the tools and processes I'm using to create these designs. Just like any other aspect of the RC hobby, such as hand-building bodies or chassis, CAD modeling takes time and patience to learn. Even 3D printing itself is a hobby, and it can take some time to build and dial in your printer, as well as adjusting the settings to get the best quality part. So if you're interested in learning to use Fusion 360, Blender, or any other software you see me use, that's my recommendation to you. Just be aware, like with most things in the hobby, expect to invest some serious time and effort into learning. I really enjoy this hobby, and I'm so happy to be able to share it with all of you through these videos and get more people interested in 3D printing and custom RC building. However, I'll be the first to tell you this niche of the hobby is not for those who want instant gratification. No matter how you construct your vehicle, it's going to take some time and patience to complete. For me though, I enjoy the challenge of designing and building a car from the ground up. Anyways, I'll talk a little more about what you're seeing on screen. I just got done working on the rear wheels, which I made by modifying the design of the front wheels, making them much wider of course. I will be 3D printing all the tires, however I'll be coating each with Plasti-Dip as I've shown before, so they'll get lots of traction. I'd like for these tires to really grip, since I'd like for this car to be capable of popping wheelies, though I can't make any promises. Some people have asked whether I'm going to be adding a wheelie bar. I don't plan on using one, though I might depending on how it drives. You also just saw me modifying the rear axle. All I needed to do was shorten the axle housing and design a simple ladder bar with panhard suspension. A shorter MA10 axle design has been highly requested for a while now, so I hope those of you who have been asking will enjoy it. Everything I'm designing here will be made available in STL form on Patreon. I'm not too concerned about suspension travel or geometry, as it's just going to be a fun car to drive around, and I just need something to keep the axle in place and allow it to have some travel. To make the chassis, I started with a FFR SC1 main chassis piece and cut the back section off. After that, I designed a new drag car inspired rear end like what you see on the right. To finish it off, I designed some tubbed inner fenders for the rear. I might have made them a little smaller around the tire than what I should, but I'll see how they work. Here's a look at the finished chassis. I made a few minor tweaks to the design that you can see here, including making the wheels larger and the tires smaller. Of course, with the design complete, it's time to print all the parts. I used a .25 nozzle to print each piece. There were a few parts that could have been printed a little better, however I'll take care of any imperfections with sanding and filler. I'll soon be assembling the chassis and taking note of any design changes that need to be made. Once I'm satisfied with the chassis, I'll be posting the files on Patreon, so be sure to stay tuned for those, as well as an upcoming build video for this project. Hello everyone! In today's video I continue the 1974 AMC Gremlin drag build by assembling the custom 3D printed chassis. If you're new to this project, check out the playlist below in the description. I've previously made a video introducing this project, and I made a video showing the design process of the chassis. I'm now ready to assemble the chassis, making sure everything fits together and functions as it should. I've posted the STL files for this chassis on Patreon for anyone who's interested. The link is below in the description. As you can see, I have all the parts that I'll be using printed. There were just a few parts I wanted to do a little post-print finishing work on. The rear frame piece was a little rough, so I took a little time to sand the bottom side and remove some imperfections before securing it to the main chassis piece using 4 1.6x4 screws. There was some minor layer separation in a few spots, which I fixed using superglue. While waiting for that to dry, I moved on to doing some work on the wheels and tires. I sanded the wheels to help remove any imperfections. I then glued the inner wheel piece to the outer wheel piece. I also glued each half of the tire together. I like to print the wheels and tires in separate pieces to make them easier to print. They're already looking pretty cool, but next I wanted to sand the tires as well. I'll soon be spraying Plasti Dip onto the tires to give them more grip. As I've shown before, I applied Plasti Dip to the tires. I also applied primer to help smooth the surface of the wheels. I continued with painting by spraying the rear axle and suspension links silver, painting the wheels chrome, and painting the chassis flat black. Admittedly not my best paint work, with the wheels not prepped as well as I could have and some runs on the chassis, but it won't be an issue. It's easy enough to swap out the wheels at a future time, but for now they'll look nice. Next I assembled the axle. As you might be aware, this axle is just a narrowed MA10, and therefore the assembly process is the same for this axle as any other MA10, except for this car is using a ladder bar with panhard rear suspension. I used two 1x4mm screws to secure the ladder bars to the axle, and a 1x8mm screw to secure the ladder bars to the chassis. Here's a look at the completed axle assembly. It's narrow enough that I'll be able to fit the large rear tires under the body. It'll be a tight fit, and I'll need to do just a bit of trimming around the wheel arches, but it should work great. Since there's quite a bit of excess axle shaft sticking out, I marked where I wanted to cut and then carefully removed these sections. I continued by securing the ladder bars and panhard bar to the chassis. Already I'm loving how this car is looking. With the rear end sorted out, I focused on assembling the front suspension. The process is the same as what I showcased previously when I built the Shelby GT500. There's a bit too much toe in due to me making the center link a little too short, but that won't be a problem as you'll see soon. I discovered that the width of the front suspension is just a tiny bit too wide, so I printed a set of narrower upper and lower mounts to use instead. I also needed to trim a little material off of the front corners of the chassis where they get in the way of the center link, so I could ensure that I would get the maximum steering angle. This front suspension assembly was just a tad bit too wide, so I swapped in the new parts that I just printed to make the front narrower. Just like with the rear axle shaft, I cut the front axle shaft so there isn't too much excess. To prevent all of the nuts from coming loose, I used Loctite. Next, I removed the rear tires for easier access and installed the rear springs. I might change these springs at some point further on in the build process, but for now they'll work. After that, I wanted to cut the drive shaft to the length I needed and install the motor. I measured how long I needed the drive shaft to be and then adjusted the length until it fit. The rear axle is sitting lower than it will once the car has weight, which is why the rear drive shaft socket is at an odd angle. It's a similar process to install the steering servo and steering shaft. I needed to cut the 1.5mm rod to the correct length. Finally, I installed the rear tub pieces. I probably will end up painting these at some point. Of course, with the chassis now assembled, I couldn't resist doing a quick mock-up, and I'm really liking how the car is turning out. Here it looks like the chassis might be just a few millimeters too long, however I think once I modify the rear wheel arches and I'm able to move the body slightly forward, the chassis will be a great fit. One thing that I didn't talk about earlier that I thought I'd mention now is that I'm using a N20 motor for this car, as you can see. I thought I'd start with a more sensible motor in the beginning, but later I plan on swapping in something with more power to really push the car to its limits, and maybe see if I can make it do wheelies. I'm not sure how much the drivetrain will handle, so I thought I'd start sensible and experiment with more powerful motors later on. I'm very excited to continue this project, and I hope you are as well. In the next video, I'll be working on the body. As always, you can get early access to videos and other special perks by becoming a member on Patreon using the link below, or becoming a channel member here on YouTube by clicking the join button below this video. That's all for today's video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hello everyone! In today's video, I continue the AMC Gremlin drag build. Now before I dive right in, if you are new to this project, I recommend you have a look at the playlist linked below in the description. You'll see all the work I've done so far, from unboxing the model kit to designing and assembling the chassis. I've got a lot that I'll be showcasing in this video, from bodywork to wiring the electronics, so let's dive right in. As you might recall, I finished assembling the chassis in the previous video of this series, so I next turned my attention to the body. Here are a lot of the parts that I'll be using for this body, including the chrome bumpers and grille. I decided that I wanted to paint the bumpers and grille black, so I placed them in a container of bleach to remove the chrome. Before, when I unboxed the model kit, the parts looked well molded, and I stand by that. However, I did notice a pretty big flaw with the front fascia piece. You can see a large part of the lower corner is missing, along with the tab that helps you place it on the body. It doesn't look like something that'd be easy to fix using just filler, so I just left it as it is, though it will be a noticeable flaw on the finished car. Hopefully this wasn't a widespread issue. At least I don't have to worry about the first scratch or body damage I inflict, since it already looks like it's got some damage before I even drive it, so I've got that going for me. I wanted to glue the front fascia to the front of the body right away, since it appeared to be a little too wide for the body. I wanted to super glue it into place now, rather than later when I'll risk messing up the paint. As a result of the front being pushed out a little because of the front fascia, the hood is now a little too narrow at the front. It's not ideal, but I guess I'd rather have a large hood gap rather than the sides of the fascia sticking out beyond the front fenders. This kit includes a lot of optional parts, including these rear window covers, which I'll be using on my build. I needed to do some sanding to get them to fit. I then began working on improving the appearance of all the parts using sandpaper, files, and a hobby knife. The finished body will look much better with any imperfections such as mold lines and flashing removed. I also deepened all the panel gaps. Some of the details on this body are a little shallow. The body is looking better after that work was completed, so I moved on to modifying the rear wheel arches so there's enough room for the large rear tires. I only needed to remove a small amount of material to get the body to fit. At this point, I wanted to lay down some primer, not only so it's ready for paint, but also to help identify any parts that need some more work. To make some of the custom parts that I'll be adding easier, I 3D scanned the body. This isn't a requirement, but since I've got a scanner, why not put it to use? It will also make designing some of these parts a little easier. For example, it made designing a custom shallow interior piece that will fit this body very easy. I did this using Autodesk Fusion 360. I want to have as much room for the electronics below this interior as possible, so I'm making it very shallow. I'm also not too concerned with adding a ton of details, just some seats, a driver, a roll cage, and a steering wheel. In addition to the interior piece, I designed a drag car inspired intake that I can glue to the underside of the hood. And just like the chassis, both of these items are available for download on Patreon. I printed out these parts on a SLA 3D printer. The print quality of each is a little poor, but they'll look good enough to use after a little work. The interior fit well and will allow a lot of room for the electronics to sit beneath it. Speaking of electronics, here's the battery, ESC, and receiver I need to install. I removed the case from the receiver so it will take up less space. I also removed the cover on the ESC and soldered on a compatible battery plug and removed the on-off switch. After that, I soldered a plug onto the motor. I connected everything and did a quick test to ensure all the electronics work. I also changed a few settings on the transmitter, including adjusting the steering dual rate so the steering servo doesn't push the steering arm past full lock. I used double-sided tape to secure the receiver and made a little shelf out of styrene for the ESC to sit on just over the drive shaft. I did the best I could to tidy up the wires. This is how the chassis looks with all the electronics wired and mounted. I'll have to shove the battery somewhere in the back, but it fits. Using styrene tubes and rare earth magnets, I made some body mounts, which I will later secure to the bottom of the interior. I made sure each mount was low enough and that they are all the same height. I've made identical body mounts as these for past builds that I showcased on this channel. Here I'm test fitting the windshield to ensure it won't interfere with the placement of the interior. I was eager to see how the motor and interior pieces would look with some primer. Some of the imperfections are quite visible, but after paint they should look alright. At this stage, the car's really coming along nicely. I've got the electronics installed and working, body mounts in place, and all the body parts are ready for paint. I'll be continuing this project in an upcoming video, so make sure you're subscribed if you aren't already. You can also become a member on Patreon using the link below, or become a channel member by clicking the join button just under this video for exclusive perks, early access to videos, and to help make more content like this possible. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hello everyone! In today's video, I'll be completing the 1/25th scale AMC Gremlin drag build. I've posted several videos showcasing this project, from the design to every step of the build process. So if you'd like to watch the previous videos I made, be sure to check out the playlist linked below in the description. I'm going to be covering a lot in this video, so let's get started. In the previous video of this series, I wired all of the electronics, added body mounts, designed and printed a custom interior and engine piece, as well as applied primer to the body. This mostly just leaves a lot of fun stuff like painting and the final assembly. I started by modifying the hood that I'll be using. This model kit includes both a stock hood and one with an air scoop. Since I made a custom engine piece, I needed an opening in the hood for the intake. By cutting off the air scoop, the opening it left was a little larger than what I wanted, so I traced the opening onto a sheet of styrene and cut out a piece I could glue to the hood. With the piece being a good fit, I glued it to the hood and then sanded the transition between the two pieces to make it as smooth as possible. Additionally, I used filler to help further smooth the transition. While waiting for that to dry, I turned my attention to the body. I started by wet sanding the primer to leave a nice smooth surface for the paint, and then rinsed the body. I also sanded the motor and interior piece prior to painting it. I applied flat black to the interior and chrome to the motor. At this point, I was ready to paint the body. After holding an informal vote on the YouTube community tab and on our social media pages, orange ended up being the winner. I applied the paint to the inside of the body first, and then laid down several coats on the outside. After giving the paint time to dry, I used gradually finer grit sandpaper to give the paint a little smoother finish and remove some dust particles. I did need to apply a few additional color coats since the paint was too thin in a few spots. While the body was drying, I turned my attention to the interior. I hand painted some details such as the seatbelts and the helmet. Although it wasn't the highest possible print quality, those details really improved the appearance of the interior and will look nice in the finished car. I also spiced up the motor a bit with some black and silver details. By this time, the filler was dry so I could sand it. After that, I applied primer and continued to do some sanding. And finally, I painted the hood orange. Although the chrome had not yet been completely removed, I went ahead and sanded the bumpers to remove a few imperfections and to remove the remaining chrome before applying primer and gloss black paint. I also applied primer and paint to the side window covers. By this time I was ready to apply the water slide decals. I decided to go with the most obnoxious side stripe graphics for that full 70s effect. I also added the rear AMC emblem. I'm not the best at applying these water slide decals. In fact, I tore a few spots, but overall I love how they look. With those decals down, I was ready to apply the clear coat. After the clear coat cured, I once again used some fine grit sandpaper and polish to help smooth the surface. It's by no means a perfect paint job, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. I thoroughly washed the body and then began masking off sections that I'll be painting flat black. I'll be painting the grille flat black along with the front fascia, so I glued it on now. The pressure may have been a little too high, so some paint snuck past the masking, but overall so far so good. I continue to add some more flat black details. Here I'm spraying some silver and transparent red for the rear side marker lights. I touched up a few spots with a brush and painted a few more details, including the silver rear emblem and the windshield wipers. While I had the silver paint out, I went ahead and backed the red taillight pieces with the silver paint. For some reason, I had issues with both the paint and clear coat cracking on the hood. Fortunately, I had no issues with the body despite using the same paint and technique for it. I ended up just stripping it down to plastic and spraying some flat black. It wasn't planned, but I ended up really liking how it looks. I used pieces of styrene to make mounts for the engine piece. I didn't want it to stick out too high above the hood. Before gluing the engine, I painted the styrene pieces flat black so they won't stand out. Once again, I used some styrene pieces to secure the hood to the body. I again applied some flat black paint so they won't stand out before I glued them in place. While waiting for that paint to dry, I applied the rear logo onto the emblem. Next, I glued in the windows and these black window covers. I used glue that will dry transparent so I don't have to worry about a little excess. The black painted bumpers look great, and I installed them onto the car. They fit the body very well. Next items to install were the headlights. I'm not a huge fan of the chrome headlights, but after painting the centers white while wiping off some of the excess, they looked better. I love how the flat black grille and turn signals look as is, so I won't be painting any further details. However, I did want to paint all of the white sections on the underside of the body. These sections won't be very visible, but it will still look better to have them painted black. I did a quick test fit with the interior in place to make sure everything will fit and the body will be at the correct height. With everything looking good, I quickly polished the windows to remove any glue smudges and then glued the interior piece to the body. Once that dried, I glued the body to the magnetic body mounts that I made in a previous video. I placed paper between the two magnets so they don't get glued together. Here I'm adding some extra glue around the magnets to prevent them from coming off. Next I worked on the tail lights by going around the outer edge with a black marker and adding the reverse lights. Earlier I designed some hood pins. Obviously being 1/25th scale, they are very small and hard to 3D print, however they turned out pretty nice being printed on a SLA 3D printer. Just like with the other items I designed for this project, the STL files are available on Patreon using the link in the description. I decided to paint them silver so they'll stand out. I glued the hood pins along with the tail lights to the body. Although I'm not sure how street legal this car would be, I decided to add a license plate to the rear. While I was waiting for that paint to dry, I polished the clear coat once more, being careful to avoid any painted details. Throughout the build process, sometimes I'll get a bunch of smudges or tape residue on the paint that I want to clean up. I also added this bumper sticker to the rear. With the license plate in place, the body is now complete. There was one final detail I wanted to add, which was the exhaust. With this being a fairly purpose-built drag car, I decided to make the exhaust dump before the rear axle rather than having tailpipes in the back. On a real car, you'd probably put them further back, depending on your tolerance to exhaust fumes, but with the chassis being the way it is, I couldn't really put it further back without it hanging low. I could have gone with side pipes or side exiting exhaust. In fact, the kit includes some side pipes, but in my opinion, I don't think they would look cool on this car. A 60 Stingray or Cobra, sure, but a 74 Gremlin, I'll pass. I printed, painted, and glued each to the chassis. And with those in place, the car is now complete. This car turned out great, and I really like the orange and black paint scheme. I also like the flat interior, which leaves plenty of room for the electronics. I think I'll be doing something similar for some future projects. That, along with the magnetic body mounts, allows for easy access to all the electronics. This is the first drag car I've built on this channel, but I can assure everyone this certainly won't be the last, as I had a lot of fun putting this car together and I really like how it looks. Of course, all that's left to do now is some driving. The car works flawlessly, though I haven't yet had an opportunity to drive the car down a 1/25th scale quarter-mile drag strip. Instead, I just tested it on this little foam mat test track. At some point, I'd like to find a long, smooth stretch of asphalt or concrete to do some passes. As I've done previously, I ended up making this car way more scale than I originally intended, and partially as a result of this, the car is pretty heavy. This means I probably won't be doing any wheelies with this car. However, I might still swap in a more powerful motor and see how fast I can make it. No surprise, there's some serious understeer when going around corners. Of course, drag cars are made for going in straight lines, but the rear tires hook up really nice even on concrete. In fact, one thing I'm thinking about trying is putting on some hard plastic tires with minimal grip. I think adding the elements of throttle control and steering would make it more interesting than just hitting the throttle at full and going in a straight line. All around an awesome car that was a ton of fun to build and drive. I hope you enjoyed this build series as much as I enjoyed making it. Remember, if you'd like to do a similar build, the STL files are available on Patreon. You'll find the link below in the description. You can also become a channel member by clicking the join button below this video. You'll get access to some exclusive perks and help make more content like this possible. Thank you all very much for your support. That's all for this video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.